Welcome to the lecture series on vitamins and nutrition. Today we are going to look at one more vitamin, which is a water soluble vitamin. So far we have been looking at thiamine, riboflavin, niacin. We also looked at pantothenic acid, and today we are going to look at vitamin B6. Vitamin B6 is basically pyridoxine. So today's our discussion would center around pyridoxine's historic significance, how this particular vitamin was discovered and what are the clinical associations that were made in the discovery of pyridoxine. Then we are going to look at different forms of this particular vitamin B6. Then we are going to look at its absorption, the way how this vitamin gets inside our system, and we are going to look at the sources of this particular vitamin. We are going to also primarily look at the metabolic role of this particular vitamin, what kind of function it's going to go and do inside our human physiology. And we are also going to look at different deficiency conditions associated with this vitamin. And so we'll start with this particular vitamin straight away. So far we have been looking at B1, B2, B3, B5, and this is B6, pyridoxine. So if you look at the structure, so can you see the structure? So this is the fundamental, I would say the heterocyclic ring. It's a pyridine ring. Okay, so that's why it's called pyridoxal or pyridoxine. We are going to see different versions of it. So since this particular vitamin contains pyridine ring, the heterocyclic 6-membered pyridine ring as the main component of the structure, you call it pyridoxine. And this particular vitamin, pyridoxine, gets activated in our system and gets converted into PLP, which is also known as pyridoxal 5-phosphate. So this is the activated version of this particular vitamin. Now let's look at the historic perspective. So you see here, this particular vitamin was actually associated with a condition called acrodynia. So it was reported by Rudolf Peters way back in 1930s. And what is this acrodynia? So acrodynia is a symptom. Acro refers to extremities. As you see there, this particular rat, you find the extremities are shriveled, kind of, it shows as if it's full of pain, and it's a kind of presentation where the rat would have severe pain in the extremities with redness. Okay, so acro refers to the extremities and dynia refers to pain. So you see one more example of a rat which is being fed normally as a control rat, and here you see the test rat which has been deprived of vitamin B complex. So you see how much changes you find over there. There are lots of changes. The visual change is like it's very lean, it looks very emaciated, and all the skin tone is lost, and it's full of dermatitis and other infection. So the first connection between this acrodynia, rat and mice acrodynia, with that of vitamin B6 was done by Paul Gayagi. Okay, so we have seen about him, his contributions, and we are going to see a little more elaborate on this particular slide. I'm just trying to give you the major flow through of discovery process. Initially they associated with this vitamin deficient studies in rats and mice, then the connection between the actual symptom and the deficiency symptom and the corresponding vitamin. So it's something like a kind of knockout experiments. One by one you remove the vitamin and see whether the symptom persists. If it continues to persist, then you eliminate those key vitamins and see whether the animal is able to show improvement. And you find over here, after they make this connection, then comes the stage where people try to elucidate the structure of this particular ingredient. Okay, so Richard Cohn and their associates have been working on with the synthesis of this particular vitamin, so they could make out that this particular vitamin is a pyridine derivative, and so they made this 3-hydroxy 4,5-dihydroxy methyl 2-methyl pyridine. So this is the chemical name for this particular vitamin. So it's, you see here as it's written there, 3-hydroxy, here you have 3-hydroxy and 4,5-dihydroxymethyl, and then you have 2-methyl. So this is the numbering of the position in the pyridine ring. So it starts from here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. So 2-methyl, 3-hydroxy, 4,5-dihydroxy, dimethyl pyridine. So it's a derivative of pyridine. Okay, now little more into the historical background, and we are going to give credits to many other scientists as well, because every discovery in vitamin study has been contributed by many people. Normally the person who would consolidate all the studies and who makes the key contribution gets the credit. Probably they are given Nobel and even much more laurels are given, but actually speaking it's over a period of time. So you see it started way back, as in the previous slide you find Rudolph group who made the discovery of the clinical symptom, whereas you find here from 34. Okay, so that's how the actual date of association starts, and that was made by Paul Georgi, the Hungarian physician. So he could make that connection, dermatitis, acrodynia. So peripheral extremity pain followed by inflammation in the skin and loss of fur. Okay, so in fact he is credited to be the person who gave this name vitamin B6. So this account of numbering vitamins is based on the chronological order of discovery. Okay, so it was discovered little late in 30s, because many of the vitamin, thiamine and other studies have started way back in First World War, whereas this one centers around the Second World War period. Then you have over here Dr. Samuel Lepkowski. He is the one who actually isolated this particular vitamin. So he made the connection and he could know that this is the particular vitamin responsible for dermatitis acrodynia. So once you develop a model of this particular inflammatory condition, you feed the animal with this source. So in the early feeding experiments, they always gave the whole source of the vitamin rather than giving a purified vitamin. Probably in the modern days, when you look at, with more facilities to purify and isolate, we give a purified version of this vitamin. Whereas in the early days, if you look at it, you basically give the source, the whole source of the vitamin. And here we have Dr. Samuel, who had been there in the role of isolating this particular vitamin from rice bran. If you recollect, we have been looking at all the B complex vitamin, and rice bran is supposed to be one of the best sources. So that's one of the reason whenever people go for polished rice, there are more chances that you would lose a lot of B complex vitamins. And you look over here, Harris and Focus in 1939 were the people who had the complete elucidation of pyridoxine structure. So you might be thinking, yeah, here we have Richard Cohen. So it's again by a group of team who were able to give and associate pyridoxine structure. And you find over here, Snell was the person way back late in 1945. They were able to give different derivatives or versions of vitamin B6. So now we have pyridoxal, pyridoxamine and so on. And you see over here the rats, these are the early pictures that are taken much earlier in the original experiments that was conducted. In fact, this particular picture is being taken up from one of the studies where people were doing a comparison between pasteurized milk and raw milk. Even now that movement is much vigorous. So pasteurization was introduced early in the centuries because keeping milk, raw milk, there were no refrigeration conditions. So the milk farmers, whenever they procure the milk, if it's not properly stored, and the milk would go spoiled, and moreover it was a very nutritious source for many infectious bacteria to grow. So Louis Pasteur actually did a series of experiments and came up with this particular temperature which is not too high, not too low, where at that particular temperature you would preserve the nutritive value of the milk, but at the same time you would destroy all the pathogenic bacteria that are likely to grow in the milk. So that's how what we call it as the pasteurization is being introduced in the milk processing industry. But down the days, now if you consider, we have more provisions for freezing milk, which was not there in the early days. So pasteurization was the only method by which you could treat the milk and transport the milk quickly and could make it available for marketing. But now people found the difference. Say for example, the pasteurized milk, although you don't destroy all the nutritive contents, there are chances where the temperature at which you try to treat the milk might not be the right temperature for preserving the vitamins intact. So in fact, most of the B vitamins present in the milk gets destroyed. So this particular early experiments where they try to make a comparison between the pasteurized milk and the raw milk, but the raw milk is not the typical raw milk being collected and immediately given. Raw milk is also processed, but the processing does not involve heat, rather cold storage. So you preserve them and you don't give opportunity for the pathogenic organisms to grow further. But this temperature, you find some of the important vitamins, especially B6, pyridoxine, because it's a thermolabile vitamin. So pasteurization has an impact on the half-life of vitamin B6, and vitamin B6 can be affected. So a pasteurized milk may not have that sufficient amount of vitamin B6 as that of a raw milk. So this is an example where rat fed with raw milk and pasteurized milk, you find the one fed with raw milk appears to be much healthier than the one which is being fed with pasteurized milk. Doesn't mean that you have to take only the raw milk in this generation. Raw milk, if it is being exposed or not properly processed in cold storage, may not be good. For that, pasteurized milk could be a better option. But if there is a certified raw milk with proper process, that is nutritionally more rich. I mean, I would say that would be the modern day version of the organic milk, as they call it. And here you find in pasteurized process, there are more government requirements that you need to add or fortify these milk with B vitamins and fat soluble vitamins. So that way, whatever that we would expect as a vitamin loss from the process of pasteurization can be to some extent restored. Okay, so now we are going to look at, so you have to remember these two people, Dr. Paul Gayagi and Dr. Samuel, as key people who did some of the early contributions in characterizing vitamin B6. Obviously, the other medicinal chemists who were there to determine the structure of pyridoxine also played essential role. Now we are going to look at the structure of various, I would say, the entities or derivatives of B6. It's not like each derivative has a different function to do. They are more or less interchangeable in the human physiology, in the biochemical mechanisms. But as you look over here, the version of pyridoxal 5-phosphate, as you call it, is the active form. So you find here there are fundamentally three main forms. Pyridoxine. So you say in the pyridoxine, the fourth position, instead of being a hydroxymethyl substituent, this is the pyridoxine version, which is the actual hydroxymethyl substituent. So pyridoxine with an hydroxymethyl substituent is undergoing little changes. You see over here in the pyridoxamine, instead of the hydroxy group, you find the amino group. Okay, because of this amino group, you call this as pyridoxamine. Instead of pyridoxine, you call it pyridoxamine. Okay, so you have pyridoxamine being mentioned as PM, and pyridoxine is mentioned as PN, and we have PL, which is pyridoxal, where the aldehyde group is there instead of the hydroxy group. So probably you can take it this way. So if you could oxidize the alcohol, the pyridoxine, you get pyridoxal, whereas if you would reduce it, you would get pyridoxamine. So pyridoxine is the fundamental compound. When oxidized gives you pyridoxal, where you have the aldehyde functionality, whereas if you're going to reduce it, you're going to have the amino functionality, which is basically the pyridoxamine. And one more interesting thing you need to notice, pyridoxine is primarily present in plant sources, okay, whereas pyridoxal and pyridoxamine, the oxidized and reduced versions, are more common in the animal food products. So you see there, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. So what happens over here? It's the pyridoxal, the oxidized version, especially the hydroxy region, in the 5th position, is being phosphorylated, and this compound is what we call it like PLP, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. And if you look at concisely what they do, they participate in more than 100 chemical enzymatic reactions in which amino acids, glucose and lipid metabolism effectively utilize this particular compound as a cofactor or a coenzyme, without which many of the reactions that involve in the biosynthesis of amino acids, glucose and lipids would be at problem. Now, as I've told you earlier, it's a very sensitive compound, and this compound is so labile that it can be destroyed by exposure to air, heat or light. So now we are going to have what is the overall function of vitamin B6. So you see over here almost like 6 functions if you could consider. Sphingolipid biosynthesis, that's a very important lipid component, structural lipid component present in brain and many tissues in our body, and it's one of the essential lipids, sphingolipids. Pyridoxine is involved in the biosynthesis of sphingolipids. Now again, heme biosynthesis. You know heme. Heme is basically the component in the hemoglobin. So for heme biosynthesis, you need pyridoxine. And then you have glycogen metabolism. So glycogen is the reserve form of carbohydrates in animal tissues. Whenever an animal consumes food, most of the food would be stored in the form of glycogen in muscle and liver. So here you see, for that particular synthesis, you need vitamin B6. Now there is one more vitamin, very interesting, folic acid, which is very essential for normal RBC maturation and function. And you find here this particular cofactor, pyridoxine, plays a very important role in folate biosynthesis. Okay, so there is one more compound, the neurotransmitter. We are going to see shortly what kind of neurotransmitters we are talking about. These neurotransmitters are also involved, where their biosynthesis is dependent on vitamin B6. So in addition to this, whatever that we have seen, amino acid biosynthesis as a whole, okay, so far whatever we have seen gives a clue to what kind of nutritive accumulation that you could expect when there is proper intake of vitamin B6, and what functions could be impaired in the absence of vitamin B6. Now here is an example of how amino acids which are synthesized and amino acids which are degraded are basically utilizing vitamin B6 as their cofactor. So now we are going to look at different sources of vitamin B6. So as you see there, vitamin B6 is abundant in many sources, especially fish, tuna. It's a very good source of vitamin B6. You have turkey, okay, so you close to 1 mg you have vitamin B6 content. Then you have banana, okay, and then salmon, then sweet potatoes, spinach and cabbage. So most of them, they contain good amount of vitamin B6. So that's why it's been arranged this way, and you find plenty of these resources available. And if you look at over here, the average adult needs close to 1.5 to 1.7 mg. Let's take it this way, 1.5 to 2 mg per day, which is very less, and a proper balanced diet would be able to supply this amount for the individual. Now, there is a very interesting point to notice as far as pyridoxine toxicity is concerned. See, in the beginning of fat soluble vitamin, and even as I was lecturing on water soluble vitamins, I used to say water soluble vitamins are quite safe, because even if you take in higher doses, you won't have problem because your body would quickly eliminate them in the urine. Whereas fat soluble vitamins have a tendency to be retained, and if not properly regulated, fat soluble vitamins can be, I would say, reverse the beneficial effects of water soluble vitamins and many functions. Here you find an example for a water soluble vitamin which has significant toxicity. So that's very interesting. You know why? When you say significant toxicity, this is dose related toxicity. Suppose if you're going to stick on with a diet which would contribute, let's say 1.5 mg to maximum 2 mg per day, you are on a safe side. Whereas if you consider people who are taking pyridoxine in the status of a drug, you are going to see they are used in the treatment of nausea, early morning sickness, along with toxylamine. Okay, so that way this particular vitamin is very flexible, and you do have a problem of how we are going to handle this. If you are going to end up having more amount of this particular vitamin more in circulation, which could be a problem, it could pose a very significant toxicity. So that's one of the reason they actually have measured and have done little bit of preliminary toxicology reports, which suggests that neurologic symptoms, okay, occur at intervals between 200 milligram per day. So if you're going to take more than 200 milligram per day, so that is something like 100 times more of what the daily requirement would be. So if people are going to consume more than 200 milligram per day, this would amount to a very tremendous high amount of this particular vitamin ingestion, and this may impair neurological functions. So you might be wondering, in comparison to other water soluble vitamin, in fact this is the only vitamin which has a very narrow therapeutic index. So if you are going to increase the dosage, self-medicate could end up in serious issues. Whereas that's not the case for other water soluble vitamins. Even if you could going to take more, it would be simply eliminated. You won't have much problem. But here you find there is a problem connected with amount of vitamin pyridoxine that you're taking inside. If you're taking it too much, you end up in trouble where you would end up with symptoms of neurological basis. See, something like sensory neuropathy. The person would have kind of aesthesia, loss of sensation or abnormal sensations, eventually can give rise to neurodegenerative conditions. So that's why we need to be very particular about the toxicity of pyridoxine and carefully titrate the dosage of pyridoxine among patients who have I would say problems connected with pyridoxine toxicity. Now there is one more condition you need to look at. Do we or can we reverse the symptoms? That's possible. If you are going to substantially reduce, there is recovery, and even there we are not yet sure what would be the toxicity profile on a long-term basis. And here we have one more fact I want to draw your attention to, and that's isoniazid. I don't know how many of you would have heard this particular drug. So this is a very important and one of the oldest drug. in the treatment of tuberculosis, okay, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and to some extent they tried treating with other conditions as well. This particular compound, isoniazid, is exactly similar to pyridoxine. Only difference is that if you look into the structure, it would be the same pyridoxine. Instead of, I would say, having the side chain, you have a isonicotinic acid hydrazide. So that's the side chain moiety or change that you would expect over there. Okay, so because of this, you have totally a different effect, and isoniazid will have access to the functional sites present in the enzyme and can defeat the function of a normal pyridoxine. So that way, in isoniazid therapy, we always ensure that the person should be supplemented with extra dose of pyridoxine, because pyridoxine formed would become inactive. Probably this will directly have an impact on the environment around us, because isoniazid is such a important drug. Normally isoniazid is not taken alone. It is given as part of the combination therapy in tuberculosis, but structurally they have a very quite similar appearance, and that gives rise to toxicity connected with isoniazid. Okay, so here you find pyridoxine in itself is toxic with a very narrow therapeutic index, and the moment you try to treat the condition, it can flare up and it can give rise to severe neurologic conditions. Whereas if you look at the other end of the story, this is a very good drug in terms of overall representation, in terms of improving the sensory neuropathy connected with neurologic symptoms. So here, for people who are on isoniazid therapy, especially tuberculosis patients and some of the leprosy patients, have to be supplemented with pyridoxine. So this way you would try to overcome the toxicity of pyridoxine. So that's why this is one exception to the water soluble vitamin, where you need to be very careful regarding the therapy. So if you could find any deficiency conditions, it's always advisable to supplement with the dietary sources for pyridoxine rather than going for the purified version of the vitamin as we normally do. But that's not the case for all water soluble vitamins. Let's say for folic acid and thiamine, you are pretty comfortable even with the synthetic, semi-synthetic formulations, which are quite rich in many of these vitamins. But the exception applies for pyridoxine, vitamin B6. Now we are going to look at how this particular vitamin is absorbed. Okay, so you see there, this particular vitamin PLP, pyridoxine 5-phosphate, here you see there gets into the stream and travels to tissues, and it is bound with albumin. Okay, so this is a dietary source. Okay, you find yeast, tuna, and many of the nuts, they are rich. Okay, so there is basically the process comes like this. So this is our destination, going into systemic circulation and being bound in the albumin, whereas the absorption occurs as a free form. So we are going to review back what we have studied today. In today's session, we have seen the historic background to pyridoxine, and we have seen all the overall historic note connected with the structural differences between derivatives of pyridoxine, and we have also seen how pyridoxine could be toxic when taken in higher doses. So I'll finish with a question. So give note on the structural differences between various derivatives of pyridoxine, and then give a note on the toxicity of pyridoxine as the only water soluble vitamin, and what kind of toxicity that can happen in case with excess dose of pyridoxine. Thank you once again for your attention. We will continue the absorption components in the coming sessions. Thank you.